The galaxy had rules. Not laws written in stone, but understandings forged through centuries of expansion, conquest, and carefully managed destruction. Wars were fought with limits, borders were redrawn without erasing stars, and civilizations were judged by how efficiently they could be absorbed or eliminated. Every species that reached the interstellar stage was evaluated, catalogued, and assigned a future. Some were integrated. Some were enslaved. Some were quietly erased. Humanity was different. Humanity was assessed, debated, and then dismissed. The first contact reports were unflattering. Humans were volatile, fragmented, and endlessly argumentative. Their governments rose and fell with alarming speed, their internal conflicts consumed resources that could have been spent expanding, and their history read like an uninterrupted chain of wars against themselves. They showed flashes of brilliance followed by periods of self-destruction. Their technology advanced unevenly, driven more by necessity and fear than elegance. The consensus was swift and nearly unanimous. Conquering them would be expensive. Assimilating them would be unstable. Leaving them alone was simpler. So the galaxy did exactly that. Humanity was labeled a marginal threat, a species too aggressive to uplift and too unpredictable to subjugate cleanly. The great powers turned their attention elsewhere, toward richer systems and more cooperative minds. Humanity was not defeated, not warned, not even feared. They were ignored. Their star systems became blank spaces on strategic maps, noted only as regions to avoid provoking unnecessarily. It was assumed they would either destroy themselves or remain trapped in their small corner of the galaxy, loud but irrelevant. While empires rose and fell beyond their borders, humanity stayed silent. They did not expand aggressively. They did not petition for alliances. Their signals faded from galactic notice, buried beneath the constant noise of larger civilizations clashing and consuming one another. To the galaxy, this silence confirmed the assessment. Humanity was stagnant. Humanity was insignificant. Humanity was a problem that would solve itself in time. No one noticed what that silence contained. As the great conflict ignited, few remembered humanity at all. Ancient alliances fractured under pressure from expansionist coalitions and predatory hive powers. Fleets that had not known defeat in millennia began to vanish along contested borders. Entire species were forced into extinction-level retreats, their last strongholds collapsing one by one. Still, the war followed familiar patterns. Lines were drawn. Treaties were broken. Reinforcements arrived too late. The galaxy had seen this before. It always survived, reshaped but intact. Then one of the oldest alliances fell completely. Not retreated. Not fractured. Erased. Their fleets were annihilated, their shipyards reduced to debris fields, their surviving populations scattered across neutral space with no banners left to rally under. Panic spread through diplomatic channels that had not known true fear in generations. For the first time, the war was no longer distant or manageable. It was existential. In the aftermath, the survivors began reviewing every option they had once dismissed. Old projections were pulled from sealed archives. Long-abandoned threat assessments were reopened. And buried deep in those records was a familiar name, annotated with casual certainty and quiet contempt. Humanity. A species no one bothered to conquer. A species left alone because it was assumed to be incapable of matching. The irony was not lost on those now facing extinction. Observers began digging deeper, past the shallow conclusions of the original assessments. They found that while humanity had not expanded outward, it had not remained idle. Their industries never slowed. Their militaries never disbanded. Their conflicts with one another had not weakened them in the way the galaxy assumed. They had refined them. Each war became a lesson. Each failure was studied, simulated, and rebuilt into doctrine. While others relied on inherited strategies and rigid command structures, humanity reinvented itself again and again, adapting through chaos rather than stability. Still, these revelations came slowly, filtered through disbelief. No one wanted to admit that the species they had ignored might now be their last option. The idea was humiliating. It was dangerous. It contradicted everything the galaxy believed about power and progress. But as more strongholds fell and more fleets vanished, pride became a luxury no one could afford. By the time humanity's name was spoken in emergency councils, it was no longer with dismissal. It was with uncertainty. With fear. With a growing realization that the galaxy might have misunderstood silence for weakness, restraint for incompetence, and isolation for stagnation. Humanity had not been watching the galaxy tear itself apart out of ignorance. They had been watching out of caution. And now, as the war spread closer to their borders, as refugees drifted toward human-controlled space for the first time, the galaxy began to grasp a truth that arrived far too late. The species no one bothered to conquer had been left alone with time, resources, and an endless supply of enemies to practice against. The conflict was about to change, not because humanity was joining it, but because they always had their own wars. The galaxy had simply never been one of them. Desperation rewrote traditions faster than any enemy ever had. The surviving members of the fallen alliance gathered in exile, stripped of fleets, territory, and certainty. Species that once debated for decades now argued in hours. Old rivalries were set aside not out of unity, but because there was no strength left to support them. Every projection ended the same way. Extinction was no longer a possibility. It was a schedule. There were few options left. Most were dismissed immediately. The major powers were already stretched thin or quietly negotiating their own survival. Neutral civilizations closed their borders, unwilling to invite annihilation by association. What remained were the margins of the galaxy, the ignored, the unstable, the forgotten. That was when the word surfaced again, spoken carefully, as if saying it too loudly might invite ridicule. Humanity. The idea was met with resistance. Some called it madness. Others called it humiliation. To ask for help from a species once deemed irrelevant felt like admitting failure on a civilizational level. But pride had not stopped fleets from burning, and it would not stop what was coming next. The question was no longer whether humanity was ideal. The question was whether anyone else would answer at all. The delegation sent to human space was small and unceremonious. No grand armada, no symbolic gestures of dominance or equality. Just a single diplomatic vessel broadcasting a request instead of a demand. When they crossed into human-controlled systems, they expected chaos or hostility. Instead, they found order. Defensive networks layered with redundancy. Civilian traffic routed efficiently around military corridors. Nothing flashy. Nothing aggressive. Just quiet preparedness. Humanity responded, not with urgency, but with caution. They did not celebrate the contact. They did not posture. They asked questions? Simple ones at first. What was the objective of the war? What constituted victory? How many civilian populations were at risk? The delegation struggled to answer clearly. Galactic wars rarely ended. They stabilized? Humanity seemed dissatisfied with that concept. Internal debates on Earth were fierce but brief. Humanity had learned long ago that hesitation could be as deadly as recklessness. Some argued that joining an interstellar war would invite annihilation. Others pointed out that annihilation had a habit of spreading outward whether invited or not. In the end, the deciding factor was not altruism or fear. It was pattern recognition. Humanity recognized an existential cascade when they saw one. Their response was not immediate consent. It was conditional. Humanity would not fight to preserve old power structures. They would not fight to restore balance. They would fight to remove threats permanently. This distinction confused the delegation. Balance was how the galaxy survived. Humanity's counterargument was simple. Balance was how wars were prolonged. When the agreement was finalized, it was deliberately quiet. No galaxy-wide announcement. No dramatic declarations. Humanity joined the conflict without spectacle, without ceremony, without the validation of being acknowledged as a great power. To many watching from afar, nothing appeared to change. The war continued its slow grind of attrition. Fleets moved. Systems fell. Humanity's name barely registered in intelligence briefings. Behind the scenes, everything changed. Human command structures did not integrate into existing hierarchies. They refused centralized control. Instead, they established independent operational zones, sharing data but not authority. This alone unsettled their new allies. Galactic militaries were built on predictability and obedience. Humanity functioned on intent and autonomy. Orders were goals, not instructions. Units were trusted to adapt without oversight. The first deployments were modest. A handful of ships, unfamiliar in design, lacking the imposing scale favored by other species. Observers mistook restraint for limitation. They assumed humanity was testing the waters, easing into the conflict. In reality, humanity was studying the enemy in real time, feeding live data into systems that learned faster than any organic strategist ever could. Humanity did not rush to the front lines. They did not seek glory or decisive confrontations. They went where no one else bothered to look. Supply routes. Communication relays. Coordination nodes buried beneath layers of automated defense. Places considered secondary targets by traditional doctrine. Humanity targeted them relentlessly, quietly, and with unnerving precision. Reports filtered in slowly at first. Enemy fleets arriving late to battles that never happened. Reinforcements jumping into empty systems where allies had already collapsed. Confusion spread through command channels as responses lagged behind events. To the galaxy, it felt like fighting an opponent that refused to stand still long enough to be seen. Still, many underestimated what they were witnessing. They believed humanity was simply exploiting chaos created by others. A scavenger in a collapsing war. That belief persisted until enemy counteroffensives began failing without explanation. Entire strategies unraveled before they could be executed. Plans leaked before they were finalized. The enemy was adapting, but humanity was adapting faster. By the time the galaxy started paying attention, humanity had already been fighting for some time. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They fought the way they always had, as if the war were already personal. As if extinction were not a threat, but a familiar concept they had been preparing for long before anyone asked them to help. The war did not escalate when humanity became visible. It destabilized. Patterns that had held for centuries began to fracture under pressure from something no doctrine accounted for. Human fleets did not form traditional battle lines. They appeared fragmented, dispersed across multiple systems, operating independently yet reacting as if guided by a single intent. To outside observers, it looked disorganized. To those tracking outcomes instead of formations, it looked deliberate. Human warships were smaller than expected, stripped of ornamentation and excess mass. Their true advantage was not size or firepower, but modularity. Hulls reconfigured between engagements. Weapon systems swapped roles mid-campaign. Vessels damaged beyond standard repair returned to combat altered rather than restored. Nothing about them was static. The galaxy's intelligence model struggled to keep up because humanity refused to present a consistent target. At the center of this adaptability was something most civilizations had outlawed or abandoned. Human command relied on hybrid intelligence, artificial systems bound not by rigid logic alone, but by human intuition and ethical constraints. These systems did not wait for approval. They learned from every encounter, recalibrating tactics in real time, adjusting probabilities faster than hive minds and predicting enemy responses before they occurred. Where other species optimized for efficiency, humanity optimized for survival. The first undeniable shift came without fanfare. A major enemy offensive simply failed to arrive. Fleets that should have converged on a key system never synchronized. Jump windows collapsed. Navigation data corrupted itself. Command relays went dark without being destroyed. Humanity had not engaged the enemy directly. They had dismantled the enemy's ability to coordinate, turning overwhelming force into isolated fragments too confused to matter. Panic followed confusion. Enemy commanders demanded answers that did not exist. Their doctrines assumed opposition that reacted, not opposition that anticipated. Humanity did not counterattack in predictable cycles. They struck where defenses were weakest, not in armor, but in assumption. Civilian infrastructure that enabled war vanished overnight, disabled with precision that avoided mass casualties while ensuring long-term paralysis. It was warfare designed not to conquer territory, but to deny function. Allied forces watched with growing unease. They had asked for help to survive, not to redefine war itself. Humanity shared intelligence freely but accepted no oversight. Their operations overlapped with Allied movements without interference, often arriving before Allies realized support was needed. Victories occurred without celebration. Losses were acknowledged, studied, and immediately absorbed into revised strategy. Emotion never slowed the process. It sharpened it. The enemy adapted, as all survivors do. They hardened networks, decentralized command, attempted to mimic human flexibility. It bought them time measured in hours instead of weeks. Humanity had one advantage no one could replicate quickly. They had been practicing this kind of war against themselves for generations. Internal conflict had forced them to evolve systems that assumed failure as a constant, not an exception. As engagements multiplied, the galaxy began to understand the scale of what it was witnessing. Entire fronts collapsed not through overwhelming force, but through exhaustion. Enemy fleets ran out of fuel they could no longer transport. Shipyards fell silent without being attacked. Populations demanded answers from leaders who no longer controlled anything meaningful. The war did not burn brighter. It burned out in patches, extinguished wherever humanity focused its attention. Attempts to confront human forces directly ended badly. Enemies found themselves drawn into battles that dissolved into asymmetrical chaos. Human units disengaged the moment conditions shifted, refusing to trade losses for pride. They returned later from unexpected vectors, exploiting weaknesses that only appeared after prolonged stress. There were no heroic last stands, no decisive final clashes. Just steady erosion until resistance ceased being viable. Rumors spread faster than data. Stories of human units holding against impossible odds, not through superior strength, but through relentless coordination and refusal to panic. Tales of ships continuing to fight after suffering damage that would have crippled any other fleet. Accounts of commanders giving impossible orders that succeeded because subordinates were trusted to interpret intent rather than follow instructions blindly. By the time the enemy recognized humanity as the central threat, it was already too late to isolate them. Humanity did not rely on singular command hubs or irreplaceable assets. There was no capital system whose destruction would end the war. No leader whose death would collapse morale. Humanity had distributed itself across the conflict the way they always had, resilient because nothing was indispensable. The galaxy began to shudder not from fear alone, but from comprehension. This was not a species discovering war. This was a species revealing what it had become by surviving it repeatedly. Humanity had not entered the conflict to win battles. They had entered to dismantle the conditions that made the war possible. And as the enemy's capacity to continue eroded beyond recovery, the realization spread through every surviving power. The war was ending, not because one side was defeated, but because humanity had made continuation impossible. The realization arrived quietly, without ceremony or alarm. It surfaced in intelligence briefings that no longer matched reality, in projections that collapsed faster than they could be updated. For the first time in recorded galactic history, analysts were forced to admit an unthinkable conclusion. Humanity had not been unprepared. Humanity had been patient. As the war sputtered toward its end, surviving powers began a full audit of human capability. What they uncovered was more unsettling than any battlefield defeat. Humanity had spent centuries running wars that never appeared in galactic records. Conflicts simulated at planetary scale. Economies stress-tested against collapse. Military doctrines rewritten after every failure. Where other civilizations feared internal war, humanity had endured it, studied it, and extracted from it a brutal kind of wisdom. They had learned how societies broke. How command failed. How morale collapsed under prolonged pressure. And instead of avoiding those outcomes, they designed systems that assumed them as inevitable. Redundancy was not a feature of human strategy. It was the foundation. Every system had backups. Every backup had alternatives. Every alternative could function independently if cut off from the rest. This was why there had been no decisive battle to point to. No moment of heroic triumph or catastrophic loss. Humanity had never intended to win the war in a way the galaxy recognized. They had aimed to end it by making it structurally impossible to continue. Supply chains that could not be restored. Leadership networks that could not reassert control. Economies that could no longer sustain militarization even if the will remained. When enemy leadership finally sought negotiations, they did so from a position that barely resembled authority. Messages arrived fragmented, routed through neutral systems, stripped of demands and ultimatums. Humanity did not rush to respond. They verified. They cross-checked. They confirmed that the enemy truly no longer had the capacity to lie convincingly. The terms humanity offered were simple and terrifying in their finality. Total disarmament of offensive capability. Permanent dismantling of war production infrastructure. Open verification enforced by autonomous systems that did not negotiate and did not forget. There would be no rebalancing of power. No preservation of prestige. Compliance meant survival. Refusal meant removal. Some tried to resist. It lasted days. Without logistics, without coordination, without the ability to move or reinforce, resistance collapsed into irrelevance. Humanity did not punish defiance with spectacle. They isolated it, contained it, and let it exhaust itself. The galaxy watched as the last sparks of organized opposition faded not with an explosion, but with silence. When the war officially ended, there were no celebrations. Human fleets withdrew methodically, leaving behind systems stabilized just enough to prevent collapse. They did not occupy. They did not annex. They returned to their borders with the same quiet discipline they had entered the conflict. To many, this was the most unsettling part. Humanity had won absolute strategic dominance, and shown no interest in wielding it. In the aftermath, galactic doctrine was rewritten from the ground up. Old assumptions were discarded. Strength was no longer measured solely in fleet tonnage or territorial control. It was measured in resilience, adaptability, and the ability to function under failure. Humanity became the standard against which preparedness was judged, not because they demanded it, but because no one could ignore the example. Only then did the final truth settle in. Humanity had not been ignored because they were weak. They had been ignored because they did not fit the galaxy's understanding of power. They did not announce themselves. They did not posture. They did not seek validation through conquest. They prepared in isolation, refining themselves against the only enemy they had ever truly known. The galaxy survived the conflict, but it did not emerge unchanged. Borders remained, but certainty was gone. Every civilization now understood that silence could hide strength, that isolation could be a choice rather than a failure. And somewhere beyond the rebuilt trade routes and cautious alliances, humanity continued exactly as it always had. Watching. Preparing. Hoping never to be asked again. Because the galaxy had learned a final, irreversible lesson. When humanity joined the conflict, it was not to prove superiority. It was to end a pattern they recognized too well. And the shudder that followed was not fear of what humanity had done, but fear of how long they had been capable of doing it without anyone noticing.